All right, so we've got this high-stakes presidential summit happening way out in the remote landscape of Alaska. Now, on the surface, it's all about peace, right? But, according to the Institute for the Study of War, the real battle here, it might not be fought with bullets, but at the negotiating table. Let's really dig into what's going on.
So this really brings us to the core question, and it's a big one. Is this summit genuinely about trying to end a brutal war, or is it something else? Is it actually a calculated play for economic survival? The key, it turns out, is to look at who's actually showing up to the table.
So let's set the scene. The gate is August 15th, 2025. The place? Anchorage, Alaska. The whole world is watching as tensions are, they're at a boiling point. And right in the middle of it all, the US and Russian presidents are about to meet face to face. You really can't overstate this. The stakes are just incredibly high.
Okay, so first up, let's talk about the summit itself. On the surface, what does this thing actually look like? Let's break down the official agenda.
The whole thing is happening at Joint Base Elmendorf-Richardson. And the agenda? Well, it's pretty packed. You've got the one-on-one meeting between the two leaders, which is obviously the main event. Then there's a bilateral lunch with their whole teams, and it all gets wrapped up with a big press conference. It's a pretty classic format for a meeting that could have, some really historic consequences.
But, and this is where things get really interesting, the real story, at least according to the ISW's analysis, isn't what's on the official agenda. Nope, it's in the attendance list. This brings us to Russia's economic gambit, what they're really after.
The key idea here is something called economic rapprochement, which is just a fancy way of saying they want to get back on good economic terms. The ISW assessment is pretty clear on this. The Kremlin's #1 goal here isn't just about the war. It's about getting some desperately needed economic relief from the United States.
And here's the proof. Just look at this table. It's pretty telling, right? When you look back at the Ukraine peace talks from May and June, were there any key economic figures there? Nope. But now, for this Alaska summit, bam, they are front and center. We're talking about Anton Siluanov, the finance minister, and Kirill Dmitriev, who's the CEO of the Russian Direct Investment Fund. So, why are they suddenly at the table?
Well, they each have a very specific job to do. Siluanov's mission? It's to basically argue that Western sanctions aren't really working, to downplay their impact. Meanwhile, Dmitriev is there to pitch Russia as this great, attractive economic partner. So you see what's happening? They're trying to frame this entire summit not just as a peace negotiation, but as a potential business deal.
Okay, so that naturally leads to the next question, why the sudden, super intense focus on economics? Well, it all comes down to a game of leverage, and right now, it looks like the US is holding some pretty powerful cards.
And look, this isn't just speculation coming from think tanks. You've got major financial news sources like Bloomberg confirming it. They're saying that the combination of Western sanctions and Russia's own wartime economy are causing serious harm. It's a pretty clear sign that whatever Russia is doing internally to prop up its economy, well, it just isn't working.
And to really get a sense of the scale of this problem, just look at this number. 30 years. That's how long it's been since Russia's federal budget has had a deficit this high. It's just a stark, undeniable signal of really, really severe economic strain.
And the reasons why are pretty straightforward. It's kind of like a 1-2 punch. First, you have falling oil revenue. That's the lifeblood of their economy. And at the same time, you have these heavy sanctions that are just choking off their access to money. So this isn't some minor hiccup. It's a huge problem that's draining their reserves and showing that their economy is just too fragile to keep funding a war indefinitely.
Maybe the most telling signal of all comes from President Putin himself. Reports are saying that he has repeatedly, again and again, asked for sanctions relief to be part of any potential deal. Now that's more than just a negotiating tactic. It's a really clear sign that he's worried. And frankly, it hands the US a pretty significant piece of leverage.
So, while all these high-level economic chess moves are being played, it is absolutely crucial that we don't forget the brutal reality on the ground. In fact, there's a good chance Russia's economic weakness is directly connected to what they're doing on the battlefield. Maybe they're trying to gain some kind of leverage before they have to ask for relief. Let's talk about the war's brutal reality and its human cost.
Get this. The United Nations reported that civilian casualties back in July of 2025 were the highest they have been since May of 2022. just let that sink in. It's an absolutely devastating reminder that even as these talks are being planned, the violence for ordinary people is actually getting worse.
And this chart really breaks down why. So what's causing all this? You can see that almost 40% of the casualties came from long-range strikes. But the really alarming part, look at the number for glide bombs. These are basically large, unguided bombs that have been fitted with fins to give them a bit of guidance. That category saw the single biggest jump, which points to a tactical shift that's having truly deadly consequences for civilians.
Now, to really appreciate the challenge here, you kind of have to zoom out and look at the sheer scale of this thing. This map from the ISW shows you just how huge the front line is. We're not talking about a localized battle in one or two spots. This is a massive, sprawling war that stretches for hundreds and hundreds of kilometers, all the way from the northern border down to the Black Sea.
Okay, so now let's zoom in on a specific hotspot, like the fight for Pokrovsk. This is where you see the truly brutal nature of this conflict. It's just a grinding war of attrition, fighting for every single town, every village. The map highlights these areas of really intense combat, where even the smallest Russian advances are getting slammed by fierce Ukrainian counterattacks. And this kind of fighting is just incredibly costly, both in lives and in equipment, which of course ties right back to that economic strain we were just talking about.
So, how does this all fit together? What's the final piece of the puzzle? Well, it shows that this summit is about even more than just economics or the war in Ukraine. It's also about the other battles Russia is fighting, the ones beyond the bullets, to try and gain an edge.
The ISW analysis points to a whole other Russian strategy here: distraction. It's a classic misdirection. At the same time they're making these economic pleas, Russia seems to be manufacturing a whole separate arms control crisis. And the goal is probably to divert everyone's attention away from Ukraine and put pressure on the US on a totally different front.
And this timeline really lays out what looks like a very carefully choreographed escalation. First, back in June, Russia starts laying the groundwork to justify pulling out of the INF Treaty. That's a huge Cold War-era deal. Then, on August 4th, they make it official, they're out. And then, just days before the summit, satellite images suggest they might be preparing to test a nuclear-powered cruise missile. I mean, come on, this doesn't look like a string of coincidences. It looks like the deliberate creation of a second crisis.
So, to wrap up the ISW's assessment, the Alaska Summit is way more than just a meeting. It's a critical test. It's a showdown, really. On one side, you have the very real, tangible power of U.S. economic pressure. And on the other, you have Russia's diplomatic maneuvering and all these attempts at distraction.
And all of this leaves us with one final big question to think about. As the lines between economic power and military power get blurrier and blurrier, this summit really forces us to ask a fundamental question about how the world works today. In modern warfare, are sanctions ultimately more powerful than tanks?